All right, as I mentioned when we started the luncheon and Lainey talked about, Coro believes that leadership starts with the individual's self-awareness and the ability to self-manage. Forging solutions to complex problems starts with us, working in collaboration with others across sectors and communities. We have to start there with each other at the local level. So for our program this year, we wanted to invite individuals on the front lines of local leadership, in the trenches of making things happen day in and day out in their cities. It's really interesting to note that the three cities that are represented here today have similar qualities. Population: Stockton, 315,000 people, Anaheim, about 360,000, and Oakland, a little over 400,000. Demographics: every time I say Oakland, there's someone shouting out there. Demographics: each city has a population that's majority non-white, and besides Disneyland, which of course is Anaheim's biggest employer, all three share healthcare and education as the biggest employers in their city. Oakland is California's 8th largest city. Mayor Libby Schaaf was inaugurated as Oakland's 50th mayor in 2015. A native Oaklander, Mayor Schaaf previously served the Oakland City Council, and she is committed to revitalization that preserves and celebrates Oakland's diversity and leads to direct prosperity for longtime residents and newcomers. She is also a Coro graduate. Anaheim is California's 10th largest city. Mayor Tait was first elected Anaheim's mayor in 2010 and re-elected in 2014. He served on the city council there for 10 years. He's also on the board of directors for the Orange County Transportation Authority. Mayor Tait ran on a platform to promote Anaheim as a city of kindness, and he won.
How about that?
A simple idea with significant impact that I look forward to hearing about more today. Thank you. And Stockton is the state's 13th largest city. Mayor Michael Tubbs is the first African-American mayor of Stockton and the youngest mayor in American history of a city over 100,000 people.
Wow.
Before being elected in 2016, Michael served as a city council member of his home district, and as mayor, he plans to make Stockton into a community of opportunity for everyone by focusing on violent crime, economic development, collective impact strategies, and education. Our moderator, Mina Kim, KQED's PM anchor and Forum Friday host. Mina started working in public radio in 2010, first with KQED's Pacific Time and then the California Report. Her work has been recognized by the Radio Television Digital News Association, the Society of Professional Journalists, and the Asian American Journalists Association, of which I'm a member as well. Mina is also a Coro graduate, married to another Coro graduate.
Oh.
Yes, it does happen. We are thrilled to have this impressive group of local leaders. Please join me in welcoming them all.
Well, thanks for that great introduction. And since we have a tight time frame here, I'm going to just go right into it with our mayors, Tait, Mayor Schaaf, and Mayor Tubbs. We are all right now experiencing and watching a new president take on a new leadership role. And so what I want to do is talk about leadership, how your thinking about leadership has changed, evolved, lessons that you've learned since you were elected. And I'd like to start with the person who was most recently elected. I want to go in order of how recently you were elected to public office. So that would be you, Michael Tubbs. What is the biggest lesson you've learned since you took office in January?
Well, I think there's a couple. I would say the first one is that oftentimes leadership is not talking, but it's really listening. I think some of the best things we've come up with over the past 100 days have been direct results of conversations with city staff or constituents or even people I may not agree with. I would say the second thing about leadership is that it's also the art of saying no. I think everyone's motivated to be involved in public service and doing good because you want to say yes to everything. This is great, this is great, this is great. But when you're in a position of leadership, as the mayors could attest to, you have to think about long-term consequences, long-term impacts, which means sometimes you have to say no and not right now, and that's not as fun. You don't get likes on Facebook for that, but that's what leadership is, right? It's being a good steward of the resources you have.
You had opportunities you did an internship at Google, you had an internship at the White House. How is the pace of government? How are you adjusting to the pace at which it functions?
And my city manager is here, Kurt Wilson, who has the hard task of telling me that things don't move at the speed of light. So, of course, just from previous experience, but also being young, of course, government moves incredibly slow. But I don't think that's always a bad thing. I think my time on city council taught me that oftentimes government has to move a little bit slow and has to be a little bit risk adverse because it's the one thing that affects everyone at scale, but also those who are the most marginalized, poor people, people who don't have a lot of options and access, really depend on government quality. So a lot of my friends are in startups, and I'm like, well, I can't just play with the water quality. Like, people have to drink that. It affects everyone, right? I can't just play with the road. So that's been a lesson I've had to learn. Although sometimes I still think we can move a little bit faster. I do appreciate kind of the care in which we make decisions.
Mayor Schaaf, you've said that you've learned the difference between authority and leadership. What did you mean by that?
You know, on my 15th day as mayor, I had a huge group of people show up in front of my house at 5 in the morning to wake up the mayor.
Yes,
and I thought, God, I haven't even done anything yet. Like, how is it that people are protesting my mayorship when I'm 15 days in? I haven't done anything. And it's actually Ron Heifetz, who's a professor of leadership, believe it or not, someone gets paid to do that, at Harvard, who talks about the difference between authority and leadership and how sometimes it's actually your authority that hampers your ability to be a leader. Because we are the local faces of government, and we have to really have empathy for the fact that government has harmed people in the past. And while we ourselves may not have personally committed that harm, we represent that harm. And to really respect and feel that and honor that, one, is very important, I think, in our roles, but it also kind of helps your mental health in moving past and not being defensive and not letting it stop you. And when we think of our greatest leaders, most of them didn't have any formal authority. Take Martin Luther King, for example. He wasn't elected to anything. So the fact that I have mayoral powers is my authority, but that has nothing to do with whether or not I lead, and that's on me.
Mayor Tait, this came up a little bit earlier about Anaheim becoming the city of kindness. And I'd like, if you could, to tell the story of how you came upon that as a focal point, because I also think in reading your background, this was an evolution for you in your leadership.
It was. And I think leaders, we have the ability to set culture. And as we know, culture is trumps policies, procedures. That's a bad word, probably, Tom. Is stronger than policies, procedures, tactics. If you could change the culture of an organization, you change everything. It's the way people think. So I'd served on the city council for 10 years, from 94 to 04. And towards the end of that, I had I noticed these signs put up around town that said, "Make kindness contagious." It didn't say buy anything or anything like that. And it lifted me up. Anyway, so I met with the fellow who was putting these signs up. His name was Dr. Jayevsky, and he's an immigrant from Argentina and a holistic doctor. And he told me a story about they're on a family vacation, and they got in an accident, and his little daughter, Natasha, six-year-old, was killed in this accident. And he said they came back, and so the entire community talked about how Natasha would talk and write about kindness all the time, and they found all these beautiful things that she had written. And then he goes, in medicine, you can either treat the symptoms, or you can holistically stimulate the body to heal itself from within. He said, that's what I do. I'm a holistic doctor. He says, I think the same applies to a city. You can either treat the symptoms, or you can stimulate the city to heal from within. He says, I think that has something to do with kindness. So I think, 10 years on the city council, treating symptoms, I call it the whack-a-mole game of treating symptoms. that just struck me as a truth. So 6 years later, I ran for mayor, and I felt I had to run on that platform because I think that's the answer. I think that's the antidote to all this stuff.
And the focus on kindness has actually had some substantive results, you believe, in terms of decreases in, say, suspensions or various things.
Well, we've done, it's a whole bunch of things in Anaheim, and it's not me doing it. It's the good people in Anaheim. And one of the things we did with our school district, city school district, my colleague Dr. Moreno, now the council member, was president of the school board. Elementary school district, 25 campuses, K through 6. They did 1 million acts of kindness, and it changed the schools just by, each kid doing about 50. Things like calls to the principal for bullying. Some of the principals said they got cut in half. Suspensions district-wide got cut in half for discipline. And even though we didn't really measure that stuff, and my business friends say, tell me about the metrics, what did it do to grades. We think everything got better, but the biggest metric is there's 1 million acts of kindness that went on in those schools, and it changed those lives. So that's just one of the many great stories about kindness in Anaheim.
And you mentioned President Trump's name earlier. I'm sure that as a Republican, you're invested in the success of a Republican-controlled federal government. I wondered, would you consider?
No, I mean,
Would you consider the president a kind man, that he's governing with kindness?
I think, you know what, so I've gotten to know, actually, a privilege to get to know the Dalai Lama through this, and he believes that kindness is in everybody. We all get it from our mothers at birth, and so yeah, I would think that he's got it in him, just like everybody else.
So as the person who's held public office longest on this panel, if you had one piece of advice for the president, what would it be?
Let that come out.
One of the themes of today's luncheon is about voice and about finding your voice as a leader. And Mayor Tubbs, one of the things that really strikes me about you, besides your incredible background, which if people are not aware that you were born to a teen mom, that your father was incarcerated when you were born and remains in prison today. And I'm wondering if you could share with us the moment when you felt like you found your voice. The way that you put it is that you learned to fret not, that things will work out if you're doing the right thing. Could you tell the story that led to that realization?
I'll tell a couple stories. There's a bunch of them. But I think, especially for folks born in poverty, silence is akin to death, in my opinion. So oftentimes, even growing up, I didn't have the fancy Stanford degrees, but I knew something structurally was wrong in the city where all the people who looked like me were dead or in jail. Or we could predict which kids would be in trouble based off their third grade. Like, even as a young kid, that really troubled me. So I always would speak out and talk. So in high school, like the speaker earlier, I was rabble-rousing at city council meetings every week. I was one of those people I listen to now. And I was always saying, you're not doing this right, you're not doing that right. And even if people weren't listening, that those acts were self-empowering. And then as an elected official, I also realized that oftentimes having a voice is being silent and not necessarily saying how you feel all the time, or not necessarily saying what you're thinking all the time, but again, to the earlier point, listening. And then also understanding, in the words of Psalm 37, just fret not. You don't have to respond to everything. You have to worry about everything. If you continue to do the right things usually work out, and the truth is eventually exposed. So I think it's been an evolution of finding voice, but a big part of it was learning as a young, poor black boy that my voice mattered. Even if no one listened, even if I had no power, that I still had something to say. And I think over the course of experiencing that, now I'm in a position where what I say actually matters. But 10, 15 years ago, that wasn't the case, but I was always encouraged to talk anyway.
And Mayor Tait, you've said that difficult circumstances bring it out, and for you, it was an officer-involved shooting in 2012 that helped you find your voice. Is that right?
Yeah, we had a officer-involved shooting and some serious civil unrest after that, and there's no playbook as a mayor, as you know, when those things happen. And I thought, how would a city of kindness respond? I ran on that platform, and now it comes down to the nitty-gritty. And a big thing is listening, because when that happens, and Libby could probably verify this, there's a tendency to kind of circle the wagons and kind of deny and say we didn't do anything wrong. But that's not what a kind city would do. It would listen, and that's what I went actually into the neighborhood where it happened and met with folks, and they had legitimate, underlying, legitimate concerns that were true, and that helped me deal with it. I listened to them and responded to that.
With the Citizen Oversight Committee, is my
Oh, we formed a Citizens Oversight Committee of our police department, which was long overdue, to create some accountability. And we also changed the culture of our police department to a kind police department, and the whole idea of community policing. But really, it's about kindness. Kindness is what, that's the mortar that holds us all together, to create that social fabric, social capital. So, really just if the police officers connecting with the community and vice versa through kindness, and you have that understanding, and that builds trust, and then things get better.
Mayor Schaaf, you've really been candid about the process of finding your voice as a leader. And can you talk about where you are in that process, and how you were able to find your voice?
Well, I mean, I'm not sure if I have. I think every day, we are also human beings. We are experiencing growth in our jobs every day. It's not like when you step into this fancy title, you stop learning or stop changing. In fact, those are probably the worst leaders of all. So I'd hate to even say that I have found my voice. I can say, particularly as a woman in elected leadership, particularly executive elected leadership, which is a very small minority in this country and in this state even, it has helped to know that voice comes from authenticity. It comes from being real, sometimes being vulnerable, and it has to do with telling stories. And it also has to do with being unafraid, and I think you touched on this. If you want to make everybody happy, being the mayor is not the job for you. And so it's ironic that I feel like my best moments are when I have made everybody a little unhappy. And that doesn't sound like the recipe for a successful political career, but at the end of the day, even though neither side got what they want, they actually probably respect how you made that decision, and that you are very clear about what your values are, what your vision for your city is. And I think that is what voice is for me.
You've dealt with both criticism and received praise for a lot that has happened.
Within every minute, yeah.
And you've had a lot happen in your tenure as mayor so far. I mean, from the very first day, as you described, you've had to deal with a sex scandal at the police department. You've had to deal with the tragedy of the ghost ship fire, criticism over budgeting. What has been
left
the
out
most...
the Raiders.
And the Raiders, you had to stare down the NFL with the Raiders, and they... And you've accepted the consequence of that, and by trying to protect the taxpayer. My question, though, is what has been the most difficult leadership challenge you've faced since you took the helm in Oakland?
I think
challenged your leadership, specifically.
Well, those are two maybe different questions. I think the hard thing about being a mayor every day, it's not just the things that you see in the headlines, because your job is to hold the suffering of a community every day. And our cities have tremendous suffering. And so sometimes the most heartbreaking ones are, like the homicides that don't get in the news, that don't have the public, putting up GoFundMe pages and pouring out support because of certain circumstances that somehow value this death less than this other death. And that is kind of an everyday tragedy. Every day that I drive by a homeless encampment, is a tragedy, and it feels like a failure in leadership, because as a human being, how am I able to walk by what is clearly not okay, and yet I have so much authority and I am not able to solve this? And so sometimes it's just those little things that I think challenge you the most. The crisis, I feel like I've done pretty well in, and part of that is I've had an amazing amount of experience in a very short amount of time. And I've had incredible people around me, some of which are in this room today, that just, the team that you have, the way that you are able to have people that share your values with you in that moment to make those high stakes decisions, that helps you get through the moment of crisis.
And through all of that you've experienced, you have announced earlier bid for re-election. What is it that...
What possessed me?
What possessed you, and also what is it that helps you maintain inspiration and energy for the role?
Oh, that is an easy question to answer. In 2 weeks, I am going to watch 400 Oakland Public School students receive more than $3 million in scholarships and mentors and peer support and counseling to go and finish their college degrees. And the initiative in Oakland called the Oakland Promise, which gives me my juice, it gives me my energy. And it's so fun to get invested in the projects that will not see full fruition while you are the mayor. The Oakland Promise, we're giving newborn babies $500 college savings accounts. So those babies will not graduate while I'm still the mayor. But that shifting opportunity for an entire generation of my city, that is the thing that brought me to office. And 4 years is not quite enough time to get something big and ambitious like that off the ground and in a stabilized state where I know that it will continue for a full generation. And so that's why, 8 years feels like the amount of time you need to actually keep the promises that you made when you ran.
Mayor Tubbs, the census data show that about 2% of our population actually run for office. What makes you want to be part of that 2%? For the city of Stockton, specifically, too?
Well, I think my answer is deeply personal, but there's probably some parts of it that we could generalize. I think the first thing is just having very real lived experiences with the issues I now work on. So my junior year while in college, I was interning in the White House in intergovernmental affairs. And my job was to work with mayors and councils nationwide, and I actually hated it. It was so boring. I was like, get me out of here. But around that same time, one of my cousins was murdered in one of the homicide spikes we had in Stockton. So it's one thing to read about it, and it wasn't the first person I knew that was murdered, but this was actually someone I grew up with, went to church with, family functions by a family member, like my first cousin. So going back to the funeral, dealing with the pain, and then also realizing that at that time there's 54 other families that were experiencing the same pain, and I felt the policy and leadership responses to that pain was insufficient. And then I think growing up in the church, being a church boy, and just hearing all these talks about how the righteous care about justice for the poor, or the idea that God has a calling, and then finally putting into conversation that it's very lucky that I was able to go to a school like Stanford, coming from where I'm from, and that part of that opportunity had to be for bigger than me. That's one thing for me to be individually successful, but there's not many people who can feel just as comfortable in the streets of South Stockton as they do at Stanford. And that access and that privilege to live and be very authentic in both those worlds, I think, told me that I had to be a part, to quote Hamilton, to be in the room where it happens, and to make sure that there was some research and some data guiding decisions, but also some heart and some real experiences and some connection to the communities we're trying to serve. So I think for me, it was just deeply personal. And at first, I didn't want to do it. I felt like I had to do it. But now that I'm doing it, I kind of like it because I'm maladjusted.
And similar question to you, Mayor Tait, in terms of what inspires you to be part of that 2%, but also just in the context of you've led locally for a long time. I mean, you were on the city council for a decade, you've been mayor now. What are the rewards of leading locally that you think are important?
I had to follow Michael on that. Here's a guy half my age and twice the wisdom, I think. My gosh. So I think this idea of representing the common good is very powerful. I actually, and I think there's a big, when you look at this job, are you representing the people? And there's often that clashes with special interests. And those are tough decisions. And I actually think of myself, when I make those decisions, we have a stadium in our city, Angel Stadium, and I think of myself, 35,000 people, I multiply that times 10, and I just get the idea of the massive amount of people, and I think of myself of actually standing on that pitcher's mound. And all those people are looking at me as their mayor, and most of them probably don't know who I am, or you may even heard my name, who knows, but they know they've got a mayor who's supposed to be looking out for their best interest. And that's a very powerful feeling when you think about the common good and doing that. And, so that's very powerful. That's why I do it.
Well, thank you, Anaheim Mayor Tom Tait, Oakland Mayor Libby Schaaf, and Stockton Mayor Michael Tubbs. Thanks to all of you.
Thank you.